Ladies and gentlemen, and hopefully we can do something of great value. We're going to do this one way or the other. We are going to accomplish this today. I'm sure. Oh, there goes a notification. All right. There's the Church One notification. Love that. YouTube has been connected. So let me go here. All right. Let me go over to do a search for Theology Central. Do that. There goes a notification. All right. There's the... all right. Here we go. We get that done. That is finished. Now come back over here. Oh, go to Sermon Audio. Go to Webcast. Oh, there's only 2 of us broadcasting currently. Gilead Baptist Church. Now, according to their metadata, it's the Sunday night service from January the 11th. So I don't know if they're just simply replaying that, which is pretty interesting. I've seen a number of broadcasters replaying like one they just done like a week ago. I don't know about that. It's already available on demand. So I don't know. I have to think about it. Well, we'll do a podcast. We'll do an episode about that maybe. But in the meantime, I need to listen to us. A week ago. I don't know about that. All right. So we're good to go there. We sound okay. I'm going to come back over here. Do a refresh. All right, we're going to try this, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to try this. Oh, I have such bad feelings about this. I do. Oh, wait, we have a Canadian, someone from Ontario. Thank you so very much. Again, anytime I see a Canadian listening to us before midnight, I get very suspicious, right? The Canadians only listen to me after midnight. So if you're here at 4:15 p.m. Central Time, I think something is up. I think it's the Canadian government monitoring me. That's what I think is happening. I'm going to go full-blown conspiracy theorist. No, I'm joking. Thank you so very much for tuning in. I always appreciate those in Canada listening. I do appreciate that very much. And it has been fun over the last few months when I start broadcasting at 11 or midnight or 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, 95% of the audience is from Canada. So it just makes me laugh to see that. So I keep making it a bigger and bigger joke. I know you in Canada don't find it very funny, but I do. So I keep doing it. All right. And I do it on the pre-show. So, I feel like, if I'm going to make a ridiculous joke, do it on the pre-show. All right. Are you ready? I hope I can accomplish this. There's something I want to try to get across. I just don't know if it's going to, I don't think it's going to mean anything to anybody else, but I hope it does. All right. Are you ready, ladies and gentlemen? Let's do this. I'm going to open up the notes that I have. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further delay, and this will be a lot less controversial than the broadcast I did earlier today. That has not made people happy. Let me tell you, I've already gotten some negative feedback on that. That did not go well, but that's okay. This one is probably going to be a lot less controversial. And then if everything works right, I'm going to come back tonight to try to handle the Taylor Swift song that I messed up before. So we're going to try to do that sometime later tonight. But are you ready, ladies and gentlemen? We have a lot to do. Let's get to it. We go live officially in 5, 4, 3, 2, and a dramatic pause. 1.
Looking at our world from a theological perspective. This is the Theology Central Podcast, making theology central.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is Wednesday, January the 14th, 2026. It is currently 4:18 p.m. Central Time, and I'm coming to you live from the Theology Central studio located right here in Abilene, Texas. Now, right behind me is a window, and outside that window right now, there are kids everywhere. The school bus has dropped off all the kids, and they're running around the neighborhood, kicking a soccer ball, playing. I was hearing someone counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They were counting there. All right, ready or not? Here I come. They're playing hide and seek. I don't know. There's kids everywhere in the neighborhood. So if you hear people screaming in the background, that's what's going on. It's West Texas. It's nice, sunny, warm. So, the kids are running around having a great time. even though, I wanted to go outside and say, hey, get off my, okay, well, I wasn't going to tell him to get off my lawn, but I was going to, do I tell them, see, the last thing you want to do is go out there and tell them to be quiet, because they're going to be like, oh, you want us to be quiet? We're going to double down. So no, they're having fun. They should have fun. That's wonderful. Great. Hopefully they just have as much fun as they want. But here, we're not about to have any fun. We're not about to have any fun. No. Because I'm going to be fully transparent with you right now. The best illustration I could give you for where I am right now, and I keep using it, is imagine a car that's found itself, stuck in the mud, and you're just trying, you keep trying to accelerate. It's just like, zzz, zzz, zzz. Your tires just keep spinning and digging deeper and deeper into the mud. And unless someone comes and pulls you out or pushes you out, you're probably going to be stuck there. And in fact, the more you try, the deeper the car seems to get, stuck in the mud. Well, I don't want to be stuck in the mud. But in some ways, I think maybe, just maybe, me being stuck where I am is actually going to become the major theme of at least a part of this series. Right? Because we're in this series on the book of Ruth. And the way we got here is because a sermon took Ruth chapter 2, I believe it was verse 7. Ruth chapter 2, verse 7. Let's see if it makes sense in this translation. Ruth chapter 2, verse 7. Yeah, well, I'll just read it in this translation. Well, no, I'll read it in the King James because I think that's what they use. Ruth chapter 2, verse 7. If you remember, there was a sermon. They used Ruth chapter 2, verse 7, where we read these words. And she prayed, and she said, I pray you, let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So she came and hath continued even from the morning unto now, and that she tarried a little in the house. And from that, she tarried in the house, right? Oh no, next thing you know, it turned into this huge sermon that this is the house built by Boaz, and it was a place of provision and rest and shade and comfort. And well, that's the church. And we need to rest a little in the church, because if we'll rest in the church, and we can be busier than we've ever thought we could be, because that's what we'll be provided for. And we'll get charged up to go out and do more. Okay. And it's like, wait, how did that become the church? What is happening? So immediately I pressed against how pastors will take things in the book of Ruth and turn it into a picture, an allegory, or a symbol. But at the same time, I had to be very honest that, at least in Ruth chapter 1, you have very much what we call narrative theology going on. You got all of these names and places that all they mean something of great significance, right? Bethlehem, the house of bread, but there's a famine in the house of bread. Elimelech, my name means my God is king. Naomi, her name means pleasant or sweet. They have children that basically mean wasting away or dying. You're like, oh my goodness, everything seems to mean something here, right? Then we have Boaz mentioned in Ruth chapter 2, verse 1, and we know what all pastors do. Boaz is Christ. That's Christ. And Christ is our kinsman redeemer. And I demonstrated theologically, he's not our kinsman redeemer. He can't be our kinsman redeemer. We're not his kin. He's not my kinsman, right? I am a child of the devil. I am by nature a child of wrath. I am outside of the covenant. If he's a kinsman redeemer, it has to be for Israel, because he refers to Israel as his firstborn son. So we already find ourselves like, on one hand, there's a lot of things here that seem to have, I hate to use the word symbolism, but it means something. It's like it's deeper than what it appears. But on the other hand, there are things that people think, oh, this represents this, and then that falls apart theologically. So how do I handle the text? So I have found myself stuck. And I think here's the reason I have found myself stuck, especially where we arrive today in the book of Ruth, all right? And I need you to hear this, because right now we're broadcasting on Sermon Audio, and Justin, right now I think we're maybe just only one other broadcast occurring right now, because this is the quiet before the storm, right? If you go to sermonaudio.com, or if you have the Sermon Audio app, just watch it. Because right now there's almost no broadcast. And about an hour from now, hour and a half from now, it's going to go from like 50 to 100 to 200 and to 300. And it's going to be churches having their Wednesday evening services. And you're going to hear sermons. sermons. Now, this is where I think this is the point I really want to get across, and I need you to hear me, all right? Once you make the decision that you're not going to turn every passage in Scripture into a sermon or a sermon illustration, you're not going to try to force every scene in the Bible to become a type of Christ. You're not going to make every paragraph secretly about us. I think the Bible at times can feel very uncomfortable. Now, you got to hear me. Look, I know what I'm about to do here. Most of you are not going to care, and you're not going to think that this is significant in any way, shape, or form. And you're not going to see the significance of it. But I am trying to make a very important point, right? Because we are so programmed as Christians to see the text in light of how preachers preach the text. And they always take the text to create a sermon. The text is there to be molded into sermons. But I think sometimes the text is actually being abused to end up with that sermon. So the sermon, everything, well, this means this, or this applies this, and this is about us, and everything is turned into kind of a moral lesson of some sort. And I think sometimes that does great damage to the text, and it actually takes us further from the actual meaning of the text. Now, for someone like me, all the Bible colleges, all the Bible institutes, all the seminaries that I attended, all the education that I pursued, and all of the years standing behind a pulpit, I would know it's Wednesday evening, right? In years past, I'd be right here, right now going, okay, I got to hurry up and get ready. I got to get to church. Okay, I got to make sure I have a sermon ready. Those people are going to show up and I've got to preach a sermon. I got to preach a sermon. So the key was to take the text, ensure that I've got clear points and clear application. It wasn't, okay, let's go to church and work on this text and try to figure out what it says and not really worry about a sermon, but worry about working on the text. Well, if you just work on the text, it doesn't feel like a sermon, and almost immediately people are going to say it doesn't feel like church, and immediately you're going to have people who want to leave your church because they want a sermon. Even though they say they want to study the text, they want a sermon. And I'm trying to explain that those are two radically different things. And so when you refuse to do that, it becomes very uncomfortable. And I found myself uncomfortably stuck. Well, what do I do? What do I do with Ruth 2? What do I do if I'm not sitting there going, well, this represents this and this represents this? At the same time, I can't ignore what Ruth chapter 1 was doing because it feels very like, whoa, wait a minute. This name means this. Okay, how does that carry over to Ruth 2? Does it have to carry over to Ruth 2? In Ruth chapter 1, it was self-evident that these things, you just look up the name, Elimelech, my God is king, Bethlehem, the house of bread. I mean, it was evident in the text. But if the text is not doing that, do I force it into the text? And I think in many cases we do. Why? To get sermons. Sometimes, I want you to think about this, the text just sits there. Sometimes it doesn't really explain itself. Sometimes it doesn't announce some big theological point. Sometimes it just shows you a normal day. And when you're used to preaching, that can be a little unsettling, maybe a little terrifying, maybe a little bit like, what do I do? I started this series, now what do I do? What do I do? Do I just stop? Now, I could stop and 99% of the audience doesn't care. Most of the times you guys don't care if I finish a series. You're just looking, it's just about content. All right, okay, well, you didn't finish that. What's the content for today? Most people are not necessarily following a series all the way through. And look, I've learned that, right? As long as I turn on the microphone and give you something and it's content, now you may like it, you may dislike it, but as long as I'm doing something, that's really all that matters. But for me, I know I feel like it drives me crazy if I don't finish, but I don't know what to do here because this text where we are in Ruth chapter 2, it just sits there. It's just a normal day. So do I turn it into some deep theological meaning? Well, there's a part of me that wants to, but am I being fair to the text? You see, when you're used to preaching, everything, and I think even if you're not used to preaching, if you're used to just church and to sermons, everything in you wants to do something with the text. You want to find a symbol. You want to find hidden meaning. You want to find an angle that makes it immediately relevant. You want to turn it into a lesson. You want to turn it into a picture. You want to turn it into a type. You need a devotional hook. You need a Sunday school lesson. You need a small group discussion. And if you refuse to do that, you're like, nope, not going to do that. You know what? It's like zip, zip, and the car gets deeper and deeper in the mud. And you're like, what do I do? Now, I know that what a lot of you think is like, well, you know what? Just move on to something else. Who cares? But I think I need you to see what's going on here, because if you can feel what's happening, then it will challenge us to go, wait a minute. How many times have we listened to a sermon where what they're actually doing with the text is not what the text is calling for? It may be a great sermon. It may preach wonderfully. It may move your emotions. It may be interesting. It may be challenging. It may make you laugh. It may make you cry. It may make you excited. It may encourage you. But if it does all of those things, but the text isn't doing those things, then you went to church, you got a sermon, you didn't get the text. And I'm trying to show you the conflict between those two things. I've tried a million times to show you that. And once you start feeling stuck, you start thinking, well, surely there's got to be more here. I mean, there has to be. I mean, come on. There's got to be something going on here, right? Surely this has to be pointing to something. Surely I'm supposed to make something out of this. And that's exactly where Ruth 2 puts us. Because when we have arrived today at Ruth chapter 2, verses 4 through 7, and I don't see it as really being a sermon. It's not a parable. It's not a prophecy. It's not even a dramatic scene. It's just a normal. It's a work day, for crying out loud. It's just a work day. Now, I know if I say that, you're going to be like, oh my goodness, what is he doing? No, it's the word of God. It represents this. And I don't know about that. What do we have? We have a landowner who goes into his fields. He greets his workers. He notices a stranger. He asks a question. Someone answers him, and boom, that's it. No miracle, no speech, no grand revelation. And if you're honest, now again, I don't know about you, if you're honest, part of you wants to say, well, okay, what am I supposed to do with that? I mean, it's for my morning devotional. It's for my sermon. It's for a podcast episode. I got to do more than just say, well, it's a work day. I don't know what to do. And I think at that moment, whenever you can find yourself feeling that tension, you have to decide what kind of Bible reader and what kind of Bible student you're going to be. Are you going to let the text be what it is? Or are you going to turn it into something that it isn't? Uh-oh. Now, we don't want to turn it into something that it isn't. Now, this is important. If you can't let Scripture be ordinary when Scripture is ordinary, then you're never going to let the Scriptures actually speak. You're going to speak over it. You're going to speak in place of it. If you can't let Scripture be ordinary, if you can't let Scripture be ordinary when it is ordinary, you're never going to actually let it speak. You're only going to try to make Scripture useful, but maybe sometimes the text, like in Ruth here, maybe it's refusing to be useful. It just tells a story. So today we're going to struggle with this. I'm going to try not to look for a symbol. I'm not going to try to look for a type. I'm not going to try to look for some hidden meaning. I'm just going to watch a man arrive at work. And we're going to trust that God is doing something in his story, and we don't need to improve upon it, even though I'm going to feel like I want to and I need to. And that's why I haven't done this episode, because I'm like, what do I do with this? I got to do something. What's going to be my angle? Look, I'll pull back the curtain. That's what pastors do. Imagine a pastor. It's 4:34 p.m. He's supposed to go to church tonight and stand behind a pulpit and preach a sermon on Ruth chapter 2, verses 4 through 7. Well, one, I guarantee you he's not going to break it down in that small section unless he's got some really powerful points to make for his sermon. Most likely he would expand the section to be larger so that he could bring in those points. He's got to preach a sermon. The people are arriving for a sermon. They need points to put down in their notebooks. They need something practical to go home and do. But that whole system is sometimes so damaging to the text. I'm not saying always. I'll try to ensure I'm not being hyperbolic, but many times, and we have encountered that countless times right here on this podcast where I review sermons. So are you ready to go to work? Are you ready? Because we're going to work. That's what we're going to read. I'm going to back this up, and I'm going to start in Ruth chapter 2, verse 1. And Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a mighty man of wealth of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. Right? And again, kinsman. I'm not going to go back and review everything we've talked about. You can go back and listen. All right. Verse 2. And Ruth, the Moabitess, said unto Naomi, let me now go to the field and glean ears of corn after him, in whose sight I shall find grace. And she said unto her, go, my daughter. Now that may sound all wonderful and beautiful, but no, it shows how desperate they are. They got no money. They got nothing. So she's going to go glean in the field. She's going to, whatever the scraps are left, she's going to pick up. All right. It shows their situation is not wonderful. And then here, I cannot say dogmatically this is a key, but I think it's one maybe of many hermeneutical keys here, especially understanding what we're getting ready to read. Verse 3, and she went and came and gleaned in the field after the reapers. Now, I know many pastors, the field represents this, gleaning represents it, and they just go to town with this allegorical thing where you have no textual grounds to do this. Look, it's one thing when you look up and Bethlehem means house of bread and this means this. It's another thing when you just start adding things to the text. So she goes to the field, she's gleaning after the reapers, and her hap, please note the way the King James says, and her hap was to light on part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the kindred of Elimelech. Another translation, which I think will help a little bit here, Ruth chapter 2, verse 3. So Ruth went out to gather grain behind the harvesters, and as it happened, she found herself working in a field that belonged to Boaz, the relative of her father-in-law, Elimelech. Now, the text doesn't say God led her there. She was given some divine revelation. An angel took her by the hand. No, there's nothing dramatic. There's nothing miraculous. There's nothing supernatural. Everything is happening under the ordinary. And I think that is so important. The ordinary. In the ordinary, God is going to work this and tell this story under the ordinary. We don't have to make the ordinary extraordinary. What we have to see is within the ordinary, God will accomplish a very important thing, right? Especially in the context. Remember the context. It's the time of the judges. What is the situation? There is no king in Israel, and everyone is doing what is right in their own eyes. How is God going to put a king upon the throne since they're running around doing what is right in their own eyes? How is that going to come about? Well, if you read the book of Ruth, it starts in the time of Judges and it ends. What's the last word of the book of Ruth? Come on, everyone should know this. What is the last word in the book of Ruth? The last word is David. You go from there's no king in the land of Israel. Everyone's doing what is right in their own eyes. And through this ordinary means, God is going to do an extraordinary by ultimately putting David on the throne. And from David, he's going to make a covenant with David. We call the Davidic covenant. And through that will ultimately lead to the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, who will then sit upon the throne and rule and reign forever. And he's going to redeem Israel, his kindred, his kinsmen. But it's all done through the ordinary. And that just reminds us that sometimes what appears ordinary does not mean God is not working out the extraordinary. It doesn't have to part the Red Sea. It doesn't have to have fire come from heaven. It doesn't have to be dramatic. It doesn't have to be supernatural. It can just be ordinary. And she just happened to come upon this field in the most ordinary means possible. And if we're ever going to miss God, we miss God in the ordinary. And I think we can be deceived by the extraordinary or the supernatural. See the book of Revelation and how people will be deceived by signs and wonders. We want signs and wonders, and maybe God is working in the ordinary. That doesn't seem to even be that he's working. She just happened upon a field. She's in a desperate situation. So when we get to Ruth chapter 2, verse 4 through 7, which is what we're going to look at today. Ruth chapter 2, verses 4 through 7. I'm going to look at it in a number of translations. Up to this point, nothing dramatic has happened in Ruth chapter 2. Ruth has gone to glean. She's working. She's trying to survive. She just happens to end up in Boaz's field. And now the story does something very simple, but super important, because it's going to introduce us. It's going to introduce Boaz in motion, I guess is a good way to say it. Not as a speech, not as a concept, not even as a redeemer, but just as a man arriving at work. Look at Ruth chapter 2, verse 4, and we'll work through this. While she was there, Boaz arrived. While she was there, Boaz arrived. He's just coming to work. So let's read the whole text. I'm going to read it from maybe a couple of translations. I'll read it from this one, all right? And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz says to his young man who is in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." And she said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." So she came, and she has continued from early morning unto now, except for a short rest. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. Even though I'm trying to demonstrate, you don't necessarily want to just do something the text is not doing. It is very difficult here for me not to want to start spiritualizing, allegorizing, creating all kinds of types. And we'll talk about some of my struggle here. We'll talk about it because it's so easy to do. And because I've heard a million sermons here. I'll read it in another translation. Ruth chapter 2, verse 4. While she was there, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you," he said. "The Lord bless you." The harvesters replied. Then Boaz asked his foreman, "Who is that young woman over there? Who does she belong to? And the foreman replied, she is the young woman from Moab who came back with Naomi. She asked me this morning if she could gather grain behind the harvesters, and she has been hard at work ever since, except for a few minutes of rest in the shelter. Now, I want to make it very clear. This is not a rescue scene, even though we may want to make it one. This is just a work day. It's just a work day. So let's walk through it quickly, right? Let's just kind of walk through it and put it together, all right? Now, I know you're going to be looking for me to make some dramatic point, and I'm going to try to show you if we just look at the text, at what the text says, we're going to have to import something into it. But all right, what do we have? Boaz arrives at work, and behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. I think that's how some translations have it. Some translations just has, while she was there, Boaz arrived. There's no behold. The King James has, and behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. And I think maybe the ESV has behold as well. So, and behold. Now, I know when we say behold, we could think, oh, look, something miraculous just happened, but I don't think that that's what is meant here. It means that there is a shift. Think of it as the camera is shifting. The scene is shifting. There's Ruth in the field. Look over there. There's the owner of the field arriving. And notice how Boaz is introduced here. Not by a genealogy, not by a title, not even by a theological explanation, just by a greeting. The Lord be with you. And the worker says, the Lord bless you. Now, does this show something greatly spiritual? I don't know. It just seems to show a man who knows his workers. This is a man whose household language is shaped by the Lord. And this, at least in that time, this is pretty normal, functional working relationship. I don't think there's anything spectacular here. It's just a landowner arriving at work. The story has not yet shifted into Redeemer mode. It's just ordinary life in Israel mode. This is just ordinary life in Israel during this time. And now, they're gleaning, they're harvesting. That means there's bread has come back to the house of bread. I mean, that's significant in the story. There's food there. Now, poor Ruth and Naomi, they can only get the leftovers, but okay. But it's just ordinary life. And I know what you're thinking. Some of you are like, oh, no, you're missing everything. Look, I have heard all of the sermons. I have written papers going into full-blown typology here. I know. But you can't just make the text say whatever you want it to say, even if it seems to fit, unless you've got something in the text that tells you, or something from other part of the Bible that seems to say, look, interpret Ruth this way. So Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said unto the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered him, the Lord bless thee. Verse 5, then said Boaz unto his servant that was set over the reapers, whose damsel is this? So we have a normal workday that ultimately leads to the question, or really the first question. Whose young woman is this? Boaz notices Ruth. Now, I know we may want to make a dramatic telling of this, maybe. Maybe it's like, well, wait a minute, this is kind of a typically, the harvesting out here is typically men. Who is that woman over there? Where did she come from? It may also indicate that he's just very familiar with who's typically in his fields. And here's now some woman that is typically not there. And now maybe the question is, it's saying more than that, because he doesn't say, who is she? Or what is she doing here? Or why is she here? He asked kind of an interesting question. Whose is she? Whose is she? Now, in this world, identity, maybe he's asking this because identity is tied to household. Protection is tied to belonging. And vulnerability is tied to being unattached. So maybe it's like, wait, whose is she? I know it sounds, well, it's very ownership-like language. I mean, we got to put it in the correct time frame that it is. Hey, who does she belong to? Whose is she? But I think it can also demonstrate, well, wait a minute, if she doesn't belong to anyone, she could be out here in a very vulnerable state. And maybe this does signify that she stands out because she doesn't belong to anyone. She's unprotected. She's exposed. Now, if you look at verse, so we asked the question in 5, and then look at verse 6. And the servant that was set over the reapers answered and said, "It is the Moabitess damsel that came back with Naomi out of the country of Moab." Now, Ruth is described here, but not by herself. She's not offering the description. Basically, the foreman of the field answers. She is the young Moabitess woman. She came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. I mean, they're really emphasizing that part, right? She's described, or she's identified by her ethnicity, the Moabite, her connection, Naomi, and her past, she came back from Moab. She's not described by devotion, by loyalty, by character. The story here is just how she is being perceived, and she is perceived very much as the Moabitess, the Moabite, who came back from Naomi, but she's the Moabite. And of course, you can understand the significance of that because the Moabites are, outcast in every way, shape, or form. This is the Moabitess woman who happened to come back with Naomi. Now, Ruth chapter 2, verse 7. So we have kind of Ruth being described, but in verse 7, and he said, "I pray," and she said, now this is where the foreman is retelling what she said, "I pray you let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves." So she came and hath continued even from the morning until now, that she tarried a little in the house. This now we get, the foreman kind of describes the kind of worker she is in a roundabout way, right? She said, "Please let me glean." She asked permission. She did not assume rights. She did not push. She has continued from early morning unto now, except for basically a short little rest. She seems to be diligent. She's not lazy. She's not exploiting kindness, and she's working herself to exhaustion. So that's how Ruth is described. Now, what is this scene doing? It's just a scene. It's just a workday. Well, it's not resolving the story in any way, shape, or form. It's not even announcing redemption. It's not changing Ruth's situation, and it's definitely not changing Naomi's situation. It simply is positioning the characters. What kind of man Boaz is, how Ruth is seen by others, what kind of worker Ruth is, that Boaz is paying attention. That gives us maybe a little bit of hope. In the normal course of everyday life, she just happens to be there, and Boaz happens to notice and starts asks a question and gets a very favorable report about Ruth. She's getting a very favorable report. All of this playing out in the ordinary, but something extraordinary is happening because ultimately this is going to lead. I know we want to make it about Jesus, but in their context, it's going to lead to David because there is no king in Israel and everyone is doing what is right in their own eyes. And notice how slow the story is going. Nothing's happened yet. There's no promises, there's no protections, there's no generosity, there's no redemption. It's just an observation. The story is kind of deliberately making you wait. And I know in preaching, we can't have that. We've got to make sure we have a sermon. See, when I'm reading this, and I already know, I'm 35 minutes into this episode, and here's what I'm already thinking. Oh, man. I got to do something with this. I'm going to get frustrated. I got to make this work. What am I going to do? Now, if I read it just like a real story, like the text is designed to do, this is exactly how real life works, right? Sometimes in the quiet, ordinary times of life, something starts. It can be very indirect. It can, before anyone knows what does this mean? What is it? What is the significance of Boaz happening to look over at Ruth? Now, as a sermon, I want to say, oh, this is Jesus looking and seeing the Gentiles and whom he's going to redeem. It's like we want to just go crazy with all of that. Now, but where does the story leave us? Well, by the end of verse 7, Ruth is still a poor gleaner, okay? Naomi is still at home, empty, bitter. She went out full. She came back empty. She's bitter. She's, man, life has not been good. Boaz hasn't really done anything. He noticed. That's it. See, Ruth 2 is not moving in leaps. It's moving in inches. Ruth goes to the field. Boaz comes to work. He asks a question. Someone tells him the story. That's it. There's no thunder. There's no music. It's just the slow beginnings of change. Now, maybe next time, maybe the story will finally start moving. Maybe Boaz will stop observing. Maybe he will speak. And maybe when he does, everything will begin to change. But for now, that's where it leaves us. Now, can I make some brilliant application? I really can't, other than we don't always perceive what is happening because we're at work. We're dealing with the frustrations of life and kids and maybe being a homeschooling mom or whatever you're doing. You're just in life. You don't have a clue what's going on. You don't see because we can't see, because God doesn't always announce what he's doing. In fact, sometimes he never announces what he's doing. See the book of Job. Job never got an explanation for that disaster. The ordinary feels so ordinary, and we don't like the ordinary because we're tired of the ordinary. I'm tired of getting up and making the donuts. I want something extraordinary. I want something supernatural. I don't want to come to church and just hear a story about a normal workday. I need it to represent this and this and this and this and this. And sometimes the text does say, look over here in the New Testament. It quotes that part of the Bible, and it seems to apply it to this. Ooh, that's good. Sometimes it's just like, until some preacher comes along and says, look at this and look at this and look at this. And then people in the pew will go, I've never seen that. I know. Because it's not there. You want it to be there because it makes for a better story. Because it's very difficult. Look, I'm going to be very honest with you, all right? When I read the text, where do you think, in Ruth 2, 4 through 7, where do you think I immediately go, oh, wait, whoa, that's significant. Where do you think? The first thing you think I see that jumps out at me that makes me want to start going, well, this and this and this. What do you think? Come on, look at it. Look at Ruth chapter 2, 4 through 7. What do you think? What do you think the phrase is? And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. I mean, come on. We're already conditioned to see Boaz as Jesus. We're already conditioned to do that, right? Because he's the kinsman redeemer. We make it about us. Now, again, my issue with that, I've already talked about it theologically. He cannot be my kinsman redeemer. I'm a child. We are children of the devil, naturally children of wrath, disobedient, outside of the covenant of hope. He comes to redeem his kinsman, which is Israel, which is when you read the gospel, basically nativity narratives, the narratives of his birth, all it's encountered. He's come to redeem Israel. He came to save his people from their sins. It's Israel focused because Israel is his firstborn son. He is in a covenant relationship with them. There are, in a sense, he comes to redeem his kin, because he is the kinsman redeemer for Israel. So it fits perfectly for that, not for me. Now, the Gentiles are allowed to be a part of it, yes, and we see how we're grafted in later on. So you could say maybe the story is pointing to that because Ruth is a Moabitess. But at the same time, really she became a part of Israel when she said, your God will be my God. Where you go, I will go. She's in a sense entered into Israel and become an Israelite. And we've talked about all of that. But for me, when I read he came from Bethlehem, I just don't know what to do here. There's a famine in the house of bread. But now Boaz comes from Bethlehem. It's hard not to see that's got to have some kind of significance, right? So I think it's okay for us to feel some pull towards that, right? I think the text is clearly, behold, I don't want to make it more than it is. I know it's a camera shift. I know it's a narrative shift, but there's a part of me that's like, the text is saying, look where he came from. I think there's some significance there, right? Maybe the question is not whether it's significant, but what kind of significance it has and how the text and how far the text will let us go. So maybe we should try to frame this in a way that doesn't collapse the book into straight up allegory or sermon, symbolism. All right? And I think we can at least acknowledge the narrator does say from Bethlehem. That's very clear. All right? He could have written, and behold, Boaz came into the field. He doesn't have to tell me where he came from. The writer doesn't have to say anything about where he came from, but he didn't. He writes, and behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. And that to me is a deliberate reminder in the narrative. Ruth 1:1, there is famine in Bethlehem. Bethlehem is the house of bread. Ruth 1:22, they returned to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest because they go back to the house of bread where there is bread. Now this goes back to, they go back to the land of covenant, and God provides for them because he's made a covenant with them, and he never completely and truly forsakes them. He will always come and ultimately will restore, redeem, and save Israel. That's where Boaz comes in, the kinsman redeemer, right? So Bethlehem is already loaded in the story. So I think it would be impossible for me to ignore it when I get to Ruth chapter 2, verse 4, right? Come on. Don't we have to at least acknowledge it? So I think we can say that the story wants us to remember where we are and what Bethlehem has meant so far. But see, this is where we got to be very careful. There are two different ways to read this kind of detail. If we go the sermon symbol way, Bethlehem means house of bread. Boaz comes from Bethlehem. Therefore, Boaz brings spiritual bread. Therefore, he is Christ. So now that's turning what's in the narrative, and we're turning it into allegorical code. And see, I got to push back on that. Now, if we go with the narrative way, the story reminds us the same place that had no bread in chapter 1 is now producing a landowner, worker, harvest, and food. See, now that's not typology. That's not symbolism. That's not allegory. That's showing that the narrative is reversing it's narrative reversal. It's narrative movement. Hey, right here. Now it could be, see, they should have never left. They should have never left. They should have never went to Moab. Because this is where God was going to show back up to take care for his people, because he made a covenant with his people. They should have trusted his covenant. But it doesn't say that in a preachy kind of way. It's just saying, see, it's Bethlehem where Boaz comes from. It's Bethlehem where the harvest is happening. It's Bethlehem where you can glean. It's Bethlehem. It's the house of bread. You should have never left it there. Now, I think in the narrative, we can say that. But ultimately, do you double down on that and bash Elimelech and bash his decision? Because ultimately, these people are in the situation they are. I mean, sometimes in life, you can just spend forever reminding all the mistakes you made and beating yourself down. Sometimes you go like, okay, those mistakes were made. Here we are. Now, where do we go from here? But I think the narrative is at least trying to show there's reversal there. I think that's fair to say. Just doing observational reading. So what is Bethlehem doing in Ruth chapter 1 and in Ruth chapter 2? Because Bethlehem shows up in both chapters, right? I think that's textually significant without trying to turn it into a sermon, right? In Ruth 1, Bethlehem equals emptiness. The house of bread is empty. There's no bread in the house of bread. I mean, that's irony. That's significant. Now, why is there no house in the bread? We've already demonstrated that. Israel would get all the provision and bread and crops growing and peace if they obeyed the covenant. If they fail, then all of a sudden they get a curse. There's not going to be the harvest. The crops are not going to grow. It's not going to rain. It's going to be empty. It's going to be desolate. So we see the covenant unfaithfulness. And so therefore, the family finds themselves in this situation. They have to go find food. But when we turn to Ruth 2, or by the end of Ruth chapter 1, now Bethlehem, it's a place of harvest, the place of fields, reapers, food, work, provision, demonstrating God has been faithful to his covenant, even though the people have been unfaithful. And God will remain faithful. Even though Israel has been unfaithful and there's no king in the land and everyone's doing what's right, he's going to ultimately give them his king, David, whom he will make a covenant with, which will bring about the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords to redeem Israel, who has been unfaithful, because nobody can keep the covenant whenever there is works demanded in a covenant. But God will keep the covenant because, well, he's the only one who can. So when the text says, hey, Boaz came from Bethlehem, I think it's telling us the famine phase of the story is over, and now we're in the harvest phase. Now that's story logic. That's not allegorical logic. This is the logic of the story. See, now if we really dig into the story, we can do so. And we still maybe even find points there to preach, right? But we're not doing so allegorically. And again, it's perfectly okay if you look in one place and then the New Testament says, oh, this represents that. But we don't have that in Ruth. Preachers do that. So what is this that Boaz came from Bethlehem? What does it say about him without turning him necessarily into Jesus? Well, it does not mean that Boaz equals bread or that Boaz equals Christ or that Boaz equals spiritual provider. It means Boaz belongs to the side of the story where now there is food, there is now order, there is now stability, and there's now land. He is a man of Bethlehem. He's a man of the fields. He's a man inside the restored normalcy of the land. While Naomi and Ruth are poor, vulnerable, and are still on the margins of that normal way things are working. So from a narrative standpoint, Boaz comes from the world of provision into the world of need. Now that's a social and story contrast. I don't think it's supposed to be a messianic symbol. So what I want to demonstrate is, without going allegorical, without going symbolic, I can demonstrate that the text does use a place meaningfully, not necessarily metaphorically. It can still have meaning. It does not necessarily have to slide over into metaphor. It's using it meaningfully at a story level, not as code. It tracks movement from famine to harvest, emptiness to work, from collapse to some kind of stability. So think of it this way. Whenever a place has been made significant by the story itself, by the text itself, then later mentions can carry narrative weight without needing to become symbolic. So Bethlehem is not necessarily a symbol, it's a storyline marker that's significant to the narrative. So maybe I could say it this way. The story reminds us that Boaz comes from Bethlehem, the same Bethlehem that had no bread in chapter 1. So the story is telling us that something in the land has changed. There is harvest now. There is work now. There is food now. Naomi and Ruth are still broke now. They're still poor now. But they're no longer in famine time. And we also know how the book ends. We need Ruth and Boaz to get together. Because go to chapter 4, because once they get together, Salmon begat Boaz. Okay, that's already happened. Boaz begat Obed. He's not begatting Obed until he gets Ruth. And then Obed begets Jesse. And then Jesse brings forth, you got it, David, which brings forth the Davidic covenant, which brings forth the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, who will come, in a sense, into the world to redeem and save his people from their sins. The kinsman redeemer for Israel. Now, if we keep it that way, I think we're being accurate and we're being fair, historically, narratively, and theologically. It's easy to think Ruth is a book of symbols, but I think it's a book of reversals. Famine to harvest, emptiness to fullness, death to lineage, extinction to preservation, no king to king. And Bethlehem is one of the quiet markers of that reversal. But I have to stress this, okay? If we make the kinsman redeemer the one who redeems Israel, which seems to be the only idea that works since Israel is God's kin, Christ is clearly shown in the birth narratives as being the redeemer of Israel coming from Bethlehem. Even Micah 5:2 points to coming from Bethlehem and being ruler in Israel. It's hard to ignore that, and the picture kind of works theologically, right? But again, see, I said picture. It works from a narrative perspective, all right? So let's try to work through this, all right? And because I want to stress this, biblically, and I know we've already talked about this before, but it's okay to repeat this countless times. Biblically, and I'm just going to really stress this, God is described as Israel's Redeemer in explicit kinsman language, right? Isaiah 41:14, I am the Lord, your Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. And if you look up kinsman redeemer, it's using the same Hebrew word. Isaiah 43:1, fear not, for I have redeemed you. Isaiah 44:6, thus says the Lord, the King of Israel and his Redeemer. Isaiah 54:5, your Maker is your husband. The Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer. Isaiah 63:16, you, O Lord, are our Father, our Redeemer, from of old is your name. This is family language. It is covenant language. It is kin language. Israel is God's son, Exodus chapter 4, verse 22. He is God's firstborn. He is God's people. He is God's inheritance. So the Goel, the kinsman redeemer category, fits God's relationship with Israel extremely well. I'm going to stress that over and over and over and over and over again, because for some weird reason, sermons leave this part out and want to make it about us. And when you get to the New Testament, as I've now already said countless times, the birth narratives, the nativity narratives, explicitly are Israel-centered. Matthew 1:21, I've now referenced it countless times. He will save his people from their sins. Luke 1:68, blessed be the Lord God of Israel, for he has visited and redeemed his people. Luke 1:54 through 55. He has helped his servant Israel. Luke 2:25 and verse 38. The consolation of Israel, the redemption of Jerusalem. And then Micah 5:2, ruler comes from Bethlehem, which Matthew 2:5 through 6 quotes it directly. So it's not a stretch to say the New Testament presents Jesus first and foremost as the Redeemer of Israel, fulfilling covenant promises coming from Bethlehem. So it fits perfectly with the Goel concept of the kinsman redeemer. Now, this is very important. I think there's kind of two claims I want to consider here. The theological canonical claim. Christ fulfills the role of God as Redeemer of Israel, which is described in kinsman language throughout the Old Testament. That is a solid claim, that is a biblical claim, and that is everywhere in Isaiah and the Gospels. Now, that is the theological canonical claim. I am on solid ground there. But when I come back into Ruth, I got to be very careful here, because Boaz coming from Bethlehem in Ruth 2:4 is meant to, if I say Boaz coming from Bethlehem and Ruth 2:4 is meant to point to Christ coming from Bethlehem, I got to slow way, way down there and be very careful. Because I don't think the book of Ruth ever makes that move. And let's make it very clear, the New Testament doesn't ever use Ruth to make that point. It makes the point without Ruth. But it's hard not to read Ruth and go, Boaz comes from Bethlehem, for crying out loud. Okay? And he's the kinsman. All right. It's very difficult. Now, to me, I think it's more theologically grounded, if I'm going to draw any picture, that it's about Israel, it's not about us. See, my brain is like kinsman redeemer equals God redeeming Israel. Christ equals God redeeming Israel. Christ is from Bethlehem. Boaz is from Bethlehem. Therefore, Boaz from Bethlehem equals the Christ pattern. But see, that's exactly where you end up with typology and allegory. And that's what I'm trying to not fall into. So if I'm going to be disciplined, this is what I can say. The Bible as a whole uses kinsman redeemer language for God's relationship to Israel. Fact. The New Testament presents Christ as the fulfillment of that redemption coming from Bethlehem. Fact. Now that's canonical theology. But I cannot say Boaz coming from Bethlehem in Ruth 2 is meant to symbolize Christ, because Ruth never says that. The narrator never hints at that. The story never develops it in that direction. And the genealogy at the end points forward through Boaz, not back from Boaz. And that's important. When I get to the genealogy, it's not like Boaz is Christ. No, Boaz is what leads to David, which ultimately leads to Christ. Boaz is not Christ. Boaz is the necessity to set up the lineage to bring forth Christ from a human standpoint. Boaz is a means in the chain that leads to David. But what Boaz does to ultimately bring about the lineage of David, or ultimately leads to David, is then you could say that's similar to then where Christ will ultimately come and redeem Israel. Ruth is about preserving the line. That line leads to David. That line eventually leads to Christ. Christ fulfills what God, as Redeemer of Israel, has always meant and what it was supposed to do. It's not that Ruth is depicting Christ. Ruth is protecting the road that leads to Christ. So in Ruth, Bethlehem equals place of famine, now the place of harvest. It marks story reversal, and it marks restoration of normal covenant life. In the Gospels, Bethlehem equals the place of David, the place of David's greater son. So maybe I could say it this way. The Goel, the kinsman redeemer concept, in the book of Ruth helps us understand the category of redemption inside Israel. The prophets used the same category to describe God's redemption of Israel. The New Testament presents Christ as the fulfillment of that redemption. But Ruth itself is not preaching Christ. It is preserving the line through which that redemption will come. Now, if I do it that way, I'm being careful, I'm being biblical, I'm being non-allegorical, I'm being very canonical, and I'm being consistent with everything I've been trying to say and argue. Now, you put that together, I think we still end up with a very different picture than 99% of sermons are going to give us, but I think we're trying to be very fair and accurate with the text. So now let's read it all together. Ruth chapter 2, verse 1, and Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a mighty man of wealth of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said unto Naomi, let me now go to the field and glean ears of corn after him, in whose sight I shall find grace. And she said unto her, go, my daughter. And she went and came and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and her hap was to light on a part of the field belonging unto Boaz, who was of the kindred of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said unto the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered him, the Lord bless thee. Then said Boaz unto the servant that was set over the reapers, whose damsel is this? And the servants that was set over the reapers answered and said, it is the Moabitess damsel that came back with Naomi out of the country of Moab. And she said, I pray you, let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So she came and hath continued even from the morning unto now, that she tarried a little in the house. Now, I've tried to break this down textually, theologically, canonically, categorically, and every other way. But we can still be left a little bit amazed by this part of the narrative. Not to spiritualize it, not to allegorize it, but the narrative. I'm going to read it from a different translation, and I really want you to grab onto this, all right? One day, Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go out into the harvest field to pick up the stalks of grain left behind by anyone who is kind enough to let me do it. Naomi replied, all right, my daughter, go ahead. So Ruth went out to gather grain behind the harvesters, and as it happened, she found herself working in a field that belonged to Boaz. Here is the powerful takeaway if you're going to take something away. What appears to be the most ordinary of ordinary work days. People are harvesting a field. The gleaners show up. The poor, the needy, the strangers, the outcast. God has established a way for them to be able to hopefully survive by letting them glean the leftovers. And Ruth is in a very bad situation, and she shows up, and she's doing that. And it just happened that she's in the field of Boaz, who happens to be the kinsman of Naomi, and then that from this is going to do something so extraordinary, it's hard to imagine. If you would have just looked at it, it's a normal work day. I don't know if it was hot. I don't know if it's cold. I don't know what the weather conditions were. It's just a normal work day. They're out there working, and she's working, and she's been working, and she got a little bit of rest. She's been working to death. It's the most normal, mundane, maybe frustrating, maybe stressful, maybe anxiety inducing, because she's got to hope there's enough here to glean, or they're not going to be able to survive. They're not going to be able to eat. She's just trying to find food. And somehow it just happened to be in the most And not only that, you talk about ordinary, she's a Moabitess. I mean, the text doubles down on that. It's the most ordinary situation that would be like, oh, come on, this is not a good situation. She's a woman without no one to protect her, no one to look out for her. She's got no protection. She's vulnerable. She's a Moabitess in a strange land, and then they're starving, and all she can do is go pick up scraps. And lo and behold, Boaz shows up. Everything from the outside, this is the most ordinary thing in the world. But what is the extraordinary thing that's going to occur from this most ordinary set of circumstances? In fact, very unfavorable set of ordinary circumstances. What's going to happen is that the lineage of David is about to start its being established. start it, clearly getting to David. And David is going to remove the problem of no king in the land of Israel. And David is going to be the one whom God makes a covenant with, the Davidic covenant, who will ultimately bring about the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. The incarnate, eternal Son of God will be born in Bethlehem, who will come and redeem Israel. I mean, who would have known? Who could have imagined that just going to work one day was going to set up the most extraordinary? It's going to ultimately lead to the incarnation of the eternal Son of God. Again, from a human standpoint, right? Because he's got to be born from that lineage, right? Right? He has a mother, but remember, he's the eternal Son of God. Okay, remember that. So to do it from a historical, theological standpoint, Mary's the mother of God, all right? He is the eternal Son of God. I know people think that elevates Mary. That's to elevate Christ. But just try to wrap your mind around that. She just goes to work one day. It's the most ordinary of situations other than a very uncomfortable and unfavorable set of circumstances, but it's ordinary. Life is difficult. Life is painful. Life is stressful. Life is filled with anxiety. She's just out there working in the field. She had to rest a little bit because she got so tired. I mean, come on. But can you imagine what's happening there? The story takes its time. But you sit there and watch it. Oh, wow. God is doing the most extraordinary thing. She just happened to end up here. Obviously, God knows what he's doing, and he's writing this story. And so from this very ordinary, we're going to get David. And then God's going to make a covenant with David. Of all the kings you can make a covenant with, this man who's a murderer and an adult, okay, all right, whatever. All right, but he's going to make a covenant. And from David, from his line, is going to ultimately come someone who's going to sit upon the throne forever. He's going to come to redeem Israel. He's going to be the kinsman that redeems Israel. Ordinary brings about the extraordinary because God in many cases works in the ordinary, but we don't see it. And I'm not saying that there's some great way to see it. I don't think we can. I don't think this is about stop what you're doing and look at what God is doing in the ordinary. We can't. If you start that, you start interpreting things and you start making things up. Nobody here could understand. It requires the revelation of God to show us what's happening in the ordinary. We can't see it. It requires God's revelation. And then God doesn't give us any more revelation outside of Scripture. So it's ridiculous. Some pastors will take this, you've got to learn to see God in the ordinary. You'll never figure, and I have preached it that way, you can't see God in the ordinary unless God reveals what he's doing in the ordinary, because it's the ordinary. That's Ruth chapter 2, verses 4 through 7. And I'm going to stop right there. Thank you so very much for listening. I hope we've accomplished something. Here's what I hear. I'm still stuck. And maybe that's the point. God bless.